Great. Well, I would say, a very warm welcome to this evening's talk, but you don't need a warm welcome because it's lovely outside as it is. So thank you very much for taking the time to come along and hear what we have to say about Stravinsky this evening. So the last talk that we did about a month ago was on Schoenberg and Expressionism, and today we're going to talk about Stravinsky and Stravinsky's ideology in the way that he composed music. He composed in a very different style compared to Schoenberg, and what we're going to try and understand this evening is the toolbox of his compositional techniques, and I hope that this will sort of be a little bit of a follow up to the Schoenberg talk, but it also should work absolutely fine by itself. So, without any further ado, let's get going. The first thing that I found rather difficult as to how to begin this talk is to where to start. There's so much music that Stravinsky's written, and when you listen to it by itself, it can sound quite random, quite disorganized, and quite unmethodical. And without any further ado, we're going to have a listen to 3 different tracks that Stravinsky wrote. Let's see what you think of this. That music is probably how my father would describe as pretty weird stuff. It's pretty weird, it's pretty clashy, and there's also a real feeling of repetition, constant repetition, and very strange in terms of it almost feels like your CD that you're listening to is skipping. So a very difficult composer to dive straight into. So what we're going to do instead is, rather than dive into that heavy material, is we're going to go back right to the beginning of Stravinsky's career and think about where his origins are. And this evening, we're generally going to be talking about Stravinsky in a chronological order. So let's start by having a think about Stravinsky and his training. So Stravinsky's dates are 1882 to 1971, and he had quite a full and very successful career. He studied with the composer Rimsky-Korsakov from 1905 to 1908. Rimsky-Korsakov, some of you may know for composing famous works like Scheherazade and The Flight of the Bumblebee. He was a great Russian nationalist composer, and he was considered to be one of the 5, that's what they were referred to, 5 great Russian nationalist composers, and the others include César Cui, Borodin, Barakirev, Mussorgsky, and Rimsky-Korsakov himself. So some of those names may sound familiar and some of them may not. With all of that in mind, and that great tradition that Stravinsky was being trained in, this of course affected especially his early compositions and a lot that he therefore wrote thereafter. What we're going to do to start with is we're going to compare and contrast 2 works. The first is by Borodin, and it's called Polotzian Dances from Prince Igor, the opera. And you're going to start by just having a listen to that and get into the sound world that these Russian nationalist composers were writing in. So let's have a listen to this Borodin to get us started. Big tunes, a big orchestra sound, and grand orchestration. Now keep that sort of sound in your head and have a listen to Stravinsky's Symphony in E flat, number 1, which is his opus 1 that he composed in 1907. If you know your Stravinsky at all, you might be quite shocked to listen to that piece of music, because it really doesn't sound much like him in terms of the star that we know him for, his later works. But it's really interesting to note the origin of where his music came from and the influence of Rimsky-Korsakov. You might remember that I mentioned that big orchestration. You'll notice that I've put as one bullet point. Rimsky-Korsakov wrote the book on orchestration. When I studied music for my undergraduate degree, one of the modules that we studied was orchestration, and we literally studied Rimsky-Korsakov's book on orchestration. He's the man who writes the best orchestration, and that means if you have a piece for piano, it's trying to figure out how to voice the individual lines into an orchestral setting. So with all of that in mind and all of that background, we now have to take a step forward and think about Stravinsky's music and how it differed from Rimsky-Korsakov's. But to do that, I'm afraid we have to do a little bit more music theory. Some of you will remember we did a bit of music theory last time, but there are 4 terms that I want us particularly to have a quick look at today. Many of you will know that scales are set gaps or intervals between each note that come as a sequence. So a typical C major scale sounds like so. And it sounds that way because there are set gaps between the notes that make it sound the way that it does. Some of them are called semitones, which are very close to each other. That's called a chromatic scale, where I'm using only semitones. And tones sound like this. And that's a bigger gap between the two. So you have your semitones, the small gap, and the tones as the big gap. What Rimsky-Korsakov came up with was a scale called an octatonic scale. Although Rimsky-Korsakov used it quite a lot, Stravinsky was the person who really championed it in his music. And an octatonic scale is where we'd have a semitone and then a tone and then a semitone and then a tone, and on it goes. And it sounds quite ethereal, quite mystical. It sounds like this. So that's an octatonic scale. Remember that term. It's one that we will keep using throughout the rest of the talk. Bitonality is where you have two chords that are different at the same time. Now, bitonality can sound quite nice sometimes, and it can sound quite extreme and dissonant, clashy at other times. If I played a couple of nice chords together, let's say a C major against a G major, it sounds fairly acceptable. But if I put something like an E major against an E flat major, it can sound quite harsh and clashing. So that's bitonality, two chords together. Polytonality is when you have lots of different chords together. So I could say take a C major chord, a C sharp major, and a D major all at the same time. And it will all sound very, very strange. I'm not sure we can even play that. Maybe I'll do something like that. I hope you understand the theory at least. Polytonality, lots of different chords together. The octatonic, bitonality, and polytonality are the three things that Stravinsky uses an awful lot to give him his own compositional voice, and is what makes his music sound the way that it does. Let's have a think about how Stravinsky started and how he got his first big break. We're going to have a look at two of his important early works, the first of which is called Scherzo Fantastique. Whilst you're listening to this, have a think about that octatonic sound that we talked about earlier. And if you know your classical music, have a think about Tchaikovsky and Wagner. Have a listen to this Scherzo Fantastique by Stravinsky and see what you think. I don't know about you, but I also hear quite a bit of John Williams' Harry Potter in that piece too. We're going to have a listen to another work now, and this piece is called Fireworks, also by Stravinsky, and it is his Opus 4. The Scherzo Fantastique that we listened to was Opus 3, so these are very early works again. Keep in mind that octatonic scale and have a listen to Stravinsky's Fireworks. For the time also, both of those pieces have exceptionally large orchestras. So that's something also to consider that will later influence Stravinsky's music. Both of these pieces were performed or even premiered at the same time in the same concert, and it was attended by a very important man called Sergei Diaghilev. Diaghilev was the artistic director of the Ballet Russe, which is a ballet company that some of you may have heard of. Now, as I say, both of these pieces Diaghilev had heard, and he therefore decided to take on Stravinsky and commission him to write many more important works. So this is when Stravinsky's career really took off. We're going to have a look now in some depth at 3 Russian ballets that Stravinsky composed. And the wonderful thing about studying and looking for Stravinsky's words is that there's an awful lot of footage and interviews on Stravinsky talking about his music. I'm going to play for you now a little interview from Stravinsky on these 3 works, The Firebird, Petrushka, and The Rite of Spring.
This was the season of spring in Paris, spring 1909. And immediately when Diaghilev came back, he wanted to see me and to make the season 1910. And for 1910, he commissioned me the Firebird. Diaghilev was a kind of Oscar Wilde. Oh, was very elegant, very chic, and very distant. It was a dandy, very distant, and very smiling and protecting. For somebody who was just 24 years old or 25 years old, was very flattering, because Diaghilev was a very well-known person at this moment. And he had his scandals with the imperial director of the opera and so on, because of Nijinsky and all this.
At the time that Stravinsky's first ballets broke upon the scene, the classic ballet was already in some decline. There was interesting new music was not being written for it, and it had come into a sort of barren period. That, of course, is the achievements of Diaghilev, who had the idea, who saw in Stravinsky somebody who could rejuvenate the ballet.
Petrushka was the first thing I wrote after the Firebird, and that was written in France and in Rome. I went to Rome with the Russian ballet. Diaghilev asked me to come and to assist him. Petrushka was an immense advance after the Firebird. And the third advance was, of course, the Sacre du Printemps. That was a scandalous advance. The big scandal of the Sacre du Printemps was a historical scandal. The public, they shouted, they whistled, and and so on, just from the beginning. And when they saw also what Nijinsky did, the scandal doubled. Then, when the curtain opened on a group of knock-kneed and long-breasted lolitas jumping up and down, danse des adolescentes, the storm broke. It was full of very noisy public. I went out, I said, go to hell. Excuse me, Monsieur Hudin. They killed for Scheherazade or for Cleopatra. And they saw the Sacre du Printemps. They were very shocked. They were very naive and stupid people. It has nothing to do with the art.
He's very upfront with his views, and I do find watching that rather funny. But one of the quotes that is really interesting just in that last snippet was that they came for Cleopatra, but these are very stupid people and they don't consider art. which is really important considering that the whole point of Stravinsky's movement and Diaghilev's ideology was to try and make sure that art moved forward and was always pushing the boundaries. So the Firebird, Petrushka, and what Stravinsky referred to as the Sacre du Printemps is the Rite of Spring. And we're going to have a particular look at these three. But before we do that, we're going to just have a think about the Ballet Russe, the company that Stravinsky worked for, and the people, more importantly, that Stravinsky worked with. So the Ballet Russe was a particularly important company, and some even think one of the most influential of the 20th century, the ballet company. And it was set up because there was a particular Parisian interest in Russian dance at this point. And quite simply, it was cheaper to put on a ballet than it was to put on an opera. So there was more possibility, and it made more financial sense for ballets to be commissioned rather than operas, which is rather different compared to the German and the Italian traditions of the opera. If you have a look at all of these composers, artists, and costume designers that the Ballet Russe employed from one time or another, all of those composers, some of you may recognize Debussy, Prokofiev, Satie, Ravel, and the costume designers, you might notice Coco Chanel was one of them as well. So that's something quite extraordinary. And bear in mind that all of this must have influenced Stravinsky to no end. And he was only 28 years old when he first composed the Firebird for the Ballet Russe. So this is a huge opportunity for such a young composer. As Stravinsky mentioned, the first piece that he wrote was the Firebird in 1910. The reason why they chose this mythology as a subject was because it was particularly popular. Russian mythology was something that the Parisians really wanted in their art at that time. Bearing in mind how important this was for Stravinsky, he was chosen after 4 other composers. So it really is quite a breakthrough for this young artist. What we're going to start by doing is having a little listen to a small extract from this Firebird ballet, which is the opening solo dance for the Firebird character. You're going to hear quite a bit of dissonance, quite a bit of clashy chords, but you're also going to hear quite a lot of bird call motifs. Therefore, Stravinsky showing us that it is a bird that he's trying to represent on stage. Have a listen. One of Stravinsky's fellow pupils from Rimsky-Korsakov, who attended the Firebird premiere, completely didn't understand this music at all. And what he said was that Stravinsky, it seems, has forgotten the concept of pleasure in sound. His dissonances, unfortunately, quickly become wearying because there are no ideas hidden behind them. This young pupil was completely wrong, quite simply. And the reason why he was wrong is because Stravinsky very clearly thinks about the dissonance, that clashiness in his music very carefully. And the way that he does it is that when people are on the stage, that is, human characters are on the stage, Stravinsky uses the traditional scales that we're all used to, what's known as the diatonic. You remember that C major scale that I played you at the beginning? That sort of tonality he uses whenever there are humans on stage. But you remember that octatonic? Whenever there are mythical creatures or sorcerers on stage, the Stravinsky uses that tone quality in his music. So therefore, making it very clear to the audience whether something is imagined or magical, or whether it's real. So it's a very clever use of scales, and really thoughtful and methodical. We're now going to move on to Stravinsky's second ballet, which is called Petrushka. You might remember at the beginning, when we listened to our little 3 extracts at the beginning, that there was that sense of the CD skipping. Of course, the CD's not skipping. Don't adjust your audio sets at this point. What Stravinsky does very cleverly with his music is that he does repetition and very short blocks of music. There is no real good way to describe it, but I'm just going to let you have a listen to it. And we're going to have a listen to the opening scene of Petrushka. This is a really fascinating scene because you'll hear lots of these block repetitions, and they repeat very quickly and very, you can't predict them. Now, each of these blocks represent a group of characters as you listen to it. So the first group of characters that you will hear is the hustling, bustling crowd that is having a party in the street or a carnival. The second characters or group of characters that you will hear are referred to as the tipsy revelers. Some of them may come out in the street before you know it, April 12th. And the third group of characters are an organ grinder and a dancer. The fourth group are a music box player and another dancer. So you'll notice both the organ grinder and the music box player are rotating a box. So you have the crowd, you have the tipsy revelers, you have the organ grinder and dancer, and you have the music box player and dancer. Have a listen to this opening scene and listen out for that block-like character. Wish I could dance as well as that when I'm tipsy. You might notice that one of the amazing things about that last little bit is that you had the two dancers and the organ grinder and the music box player competing for the crowd's attention, and there's that both parts of the music over trying to overshadow each other. It's quite extraordinary, and it's almost like the beginning of what film music would become. A lot of that within it you would have heard if you had listened carefully and known the tunes of the day. You would have heard folk songs, Russian songs, French songs, and Viennese waltzes, which Stravinsky incorporated into all of his music. Some people have compared this sort of music that Stravinsky writes, this block-like music, to the Cubism movement that Picasso and Matisse used in their paintings. The next example that we're going to have a look at is the very famous Petrushka chord. Now, Petrushka, to give you a little bit of background into the ballet, Petrushka is a puppet, and this scene that we're going to follow very briefly is where Petrushka the puppet is thrown into prison from his sorcerer owner. And there's going to be a point where you're going to see Petrushka miming that he's screaming at the picture of this sorcerer in frustration for being imprisoned. Now, there are a few things that I want to tell you a little bit about before we get started with this piece. And that is the bitonality. You remember the two chords when they overlap each other? What you'll hear about 10 seconds in or so is that you'll hear two clarinets playing this. Which sounds a little bit strange, both of the clarinets together. But if I play the first clarinet like this, it's a nice, beautiful, easy to listen to C major arpeggio. Whereas the second clarinet plays an F sharp major arpeggio. So they are two very different chords which sound fine by themselves, but put them together. So that's a perfect example of bitonality. There will also be a moment, the climax of the scene, when Petrushka is shouting at this picture of the sorcerer, where you'll hear this chord. Now that chord sounds very dissonant and clashy when you listen to it, it's just like that. But if I break it down and play you a C major chord against an F sharp major chord, they sound fine by themselves, but the bitonality, putting them together, creates a very different tonality and a very different feel to the music that has come before it. So let's have a listen without any further ado to this scene and see what you think. So that block-like repetition that we heard in the first scene and that bitonality that we heard in the second scene are two really big developments that Stravinsky created in the Petrushka ballet. But what Stravinsky does even better in his next ballet, which is called The Rite of Spring, is where he brings both of those elements together. And we're going to have a look at that ballet now. The Rite of Spring is often regarded as one of the pinnacle works of the 20th century, and indeed the whole of classical music tradition. When it was premiered, a staged riot took place, but many of the feelings were very genuine because of the music being so shocking, but also because of the ballet being very strange and the costumes being not what the audience would have expected at all. It's also rather controversial because of the theme. Primitivism, like we say, prehistoric Russia is what they're going for, is very anti-Parisian. So Paris back in this time is all about fashion and good things and everything that we will want from a sophisticated society. So this is very much against all of that. So something very controversial for a composer to compose about. We're going to have a look at one of the first dances from the Rite of Spring, and it's called the Dance of the Adolescents. Stravinsky once again composes in very clear blocks, and the first block is where we have 59 chords played the same way over and over again with very strange offbeat accents, and it sounds something like this. Now those chords may sound very, very dissonant, but if I break them down to you, the cellos and the violas, sorry, the double basses and the cellos are playing this. A nice easy E major arpeggio, or even chord. And the violas and the second violins play this, which is a very nice E flat major seventh chord. But you put the two together and we have another example of bitonality. You will hear that block to start with. Then you'll hear another block where we have a cor anglais playing this, which is in the key of E flat major. You'll then hear the bassoons playing something in between E minor and C major. That will be at the same time as the cor anglais. And then you'll also hear the cellos and the basses playing a pizzicato, E major, E minor. So the whole of it together, I can't really play, but I can play two parts. So both of those together sound pretty strange. Combine that with the bassoons, and you really have some polytonality at that point. So what we're going to do now, without any further ado, is listen to this very controversial ballet, The First Dance of the Adolescents. you'll have noticed that those offbeat chords throughout gives it a real sense of unbelievable strangeness and no sense of structure, but it is very, very clearly structured. Now, as the bullet points have mentioned, this is an imagined pagan ritual that Stravinsky came up with in his head. And at the end of this pagan ritual, a virgin girl is taken and sacrificed by dancing herself to death. So it's a rather dark ballet, as you can pick up. The sacrificial dance is one of the most amazing parts of this ballet, because it incorporates the bitonality, the polytonality, and those overwhelming syncopated rhythms all in one. And rather than me have a go at trying to explain it, I found a very good video by Michael Tilson Thomas and the San Francisco Symphony Orchestra, which is about 3 minutes long, that I hope will explain it perfectly to you.
Now, those last few notes that Ben played, that boop, 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 is the introduction to the actual sacrificial dance. Stravinsky played this piece on the piano as a kind of improvisation for a long time, and he couldn't imagine how he could write this down.
This is one of the parts where Stravinsky had a difficult time notating the piece, and I think it posed a lot of challenges for him. It's a sound that he had no conventional way of really expressing.
He felt the rhythms so powerfully in his body, the rhythms he imagined that would be wrenching and contorting and snapping the neck and motivating the jumps. But he could not imagine how it could be written down. It seemed so chaotic. And yet there is a design. It's a design of very simple musical gestures arranged in a very cunning way. Now listen in slow motion what they are. The simplest is just an alternating on-beat and snappy off-beat. But you notice that the double basses play the first downbeat, and the timpani plays the next downbeat, and that dialogue is what bumps it up. Let's do that once more. Now, the next part of it is a masterfully placed silence, followed by an exaggerated crescendo by brass instruments. There we go. And the last is 3 consecutive short notes played by strings and winds. So you got that? The first one is the second one is and the last one is And this pattern, which repeats many times, sometimes with a couple more bars, sometimes with a couple less bars, is what gives that inevitable but kind of wonderfully off-kilter feeling.
Just thought to myself, there's no test at the end. Don't worry, you're not expected to know all of this. all of these very strange structures. Although they seem very strange, I hope that you'll appreciate now that it's a very, very clear structure. And although it sounds very random and clashy, there's a real clear method to this. And that's what I hope you'll take away from this evening. What we have listened to for all of the extracts that we've listened to before have been referred to as Stravinsky's Russian period, his Russian period of composition. And what Stravinsky has done in all of that is that he has rewritten folk songs into his style and into his music. What happened in 1919 was that his impresario, his artistic director, Diaghilev, commissions him to reorchestrate a couple of pieces by a composer called Pergolesi. Pergolesi is a composer of the 18th century. At least it was contributed to Pergolesi of the 18th century. Now, all that Stravinsky was asked to do was take these tunes and then rewrite them, reorchestrate them in his own style. And the result is remarkably similar between the two. So what we're going to do is we're going to compare and contrast the two. To start with, have a listen to this Pergolesi and see what you think. Now keep that in your head and have a listen to Stravinsky's rewrite of it. Now, as you listen to that, I'm sure you're thinking, well, they sound exactly the same, and they do. And that's the point, is that all that Stravinsky was asked to do in this case was that he was going to take a piece of music by Pergolesi, reorchestrate it, and create it in his sort of modern way. And the way that he particularly does it is that you'll notice that the attack of the notes are much shorter. And so there's what's often referred to as that Stravinsky sound, that staccato, very short, spiky sound to his music. So Stravinsky thought, well, if I can do this, why don't I continue in this style? Why don't I continue rewriting music of an earlier era and putting it into my music, but making it more of my own? And that's exactly what he did. And that's where his very famous quote comes from: lesser artists borrow, great artists steal. And what happened as a result was that Stravinsky claimed for his own the artistic form called neoclassicism. Now, neoclassicism, why did he choose neoclassicism? Why didn't he choose any other form of artistic expression? Well, Stravinsky decided to choose neoclassicism because, well, for many reasons, but there are two main ones. One was that not many people were doing it. Not many people were using neoclassical style in their music. So for him, it was a unique selling point to his composition. And then also, you might remember in his Russian period, that what he did a lot was that he rewrote Russian music into his music in a modern style. So it made perfect sense for him to rewrite music of an earlier tradition into his music with a modern accent. Why was it an idea for him to move away from using Russian music? Well, this is all to do with the political issues of the time. Remember 1919, that we've just come out of the First World War, and nationalism is bad, Russian music is bad, and Romanticism as well, the movement that's come before in the 19th century, is particularly bad. And the reason why it is particularly bad is because Romanticism is over-emotional, over-expressive, and Stravinsky didn't want that in his music, as the fashion was of that time. It's interesting to note that Schoenberg, though, on the other hand, did put a lot of expression in his music using expressionism. Perhaps that's because he came from the Austrian and the German tradition. It's just something to bear in mind. Going back to Stravinsky's neoclassical ideology, this was particularly important in 1910 to 1950 when he was writing in this sort of style. And he said a particular quote that really gives you an idea as to what the neoclassical writers were thinking at the time. He said, "For I consider that music is, by its very nature, essentially powerless to express anything at all, whether a feeling, an attitude of mind, a psychological mood, a phenomenon of nature, etc. Expression has never been an inherent property of music. Instead, it is an aspect unconsciously or by force of habit we have come to confuse with its essential being." Now that for us may seem extremely counterintuitive, that music, the whole point of music is expression, but this is not what the neoclassicists believed. They believed that music was for the sake of music and because it quite simply sounded nice. One final thing to note is that neoclassicism is a slightly misleading term. In this movement of neoclassicism at the beginning of the 20th century, classical music, so the classical period that we consider to be nowadays as the composers like Mozart and Haydn, back then they also incorporated what we consider to be the Baroque period. So bear in mind that this neoclassicism also incorporates Baroque music like J.S. Bach, Vivaldi, and Corelli, so to name a few. So keep those in mind when you're considering neoclassicism for Stravinsky as he wrote it. A couple of other examples of neoclassicism before Stravinsky are Grieg's Holberg Suite and Ravel's Tombeau de Couperin. So that just gives you an idea as to the neoclassical movement. What we have now is that we're going to have a look at lots of different examples of what Stravinsky was originally influenced by and what he therefore composed afterwards. What you're going to notice is that the two of each extract are going to sound very familiar, very similar to each other, but they are going to be different in terms of Stravinsky using his bitonality and his octatonic. You remember those two terms. And then also that block-like repetition that he uses, and how he uses lots of offbeat rhythms to just play with our expectation a lot. To start with, we're going to have a listen to some J.S. Bach. We're going to have a listen to his first Brandenburg Concerto, Movement 1. So got that sound in your head? Now have a listen to Stravinsky's rewrite. This is his concerto in E flat, which is nicknamed Dumbarton Oaks. I found myself tapping my foot along to that one, but then the problem is that you find yourself tapping along and then you go, oh, I've lost the beat, and then it restarts again. And that's exactly what Stravinsky's trying to do. He's trying to play with your expectation. Have a listen to this piece of Mozart, which is nicknamed the Gran Partita, one of his wind serenades. Keeping that sound in your head, let's have a listen to Stravinsky's rewrite. This is the octet. You might have noticed that both of those pieces, both of those Stravinsky pieces, although they have that bitonality, that polytonality, and they have that repetition that you can't really keep track of, there's also a sense of real comedy and jokishness and sarcasm to them. And that's also continued on in another one of Stravinsky's experiments into. He had a bit of an experiment with writing jazz, and one of the pieces that he wrote was the Ebony Concerto. I would love to play you more examples of jazz-like pieces, but we don't have the time. Once again, you'll hear in this piece that there's lots of sarcasm and comedy in the music. And once again, all of the three, the bitonality, the polytonality, a bit of octatonic, and all of those offbeat rhythms will just play with your expectation. So have a listen to this big band rewrite, if you will. This is Stravinsky's Ebony Concerto. Something I just thought of whilst listening to that again is that when you listen to it, it's almost as though he's teasing you, in that you listen to a small chunk and then he repeats it quite a few times and you sort of think, oh yeah, I've gotten used to that. And then he suddenly changes the mood to something else. So constantly playing with your expectation and playing with your subconscious. So it's really quite extraordinary. So this is just a tiny taste of Stravinsky's music, and any of those ballets, I feel like I could have done a whole lecture on, because there is so much to talk about when it comes to Stravinsky's music, and the amount of pieces that we've missed, like Oedipus Rex, Symphony of Psalms, the Rake's Progress, The Soldier's Tale, all of these great works that we simply haven't had the time for. But I hope this has given you at least just a little bit of a taster and a bit more of an understanding as to what Stravinsky's music is all about. What Stravinsky has done so wonderfully, and perhaps the reason why he was such a popular composer throughout his lifetime, was that he was flexible in the way that he composed, in remodeling old styles and bringing them into the 20th century or the modern day for him, but always in a cheeky, jokey way. And that's what Stravinsky's music is often about. It's about fun. It's about a bit of sarcasm from time to time. And I thought it would be nice to finish, rather than just to simply stop, would be to have a listen to Stravinsky actually performing some of his own work. And there was a very famous performance of him conducting the Royal Festival Hall in 1965, where he conducted the suite to the Firebird. So we're going to finish by listening to the final hymn, which is where the prince and the princess are crowned king and queen, and the evil sorcerer is thrown out of the kingdom. So let's have a listen to that to finish with, and you'll see Stravinsky conducting his own music. that will give you some food for thought the next time you have a listen to Stravinsky. And if you find yourself wanting to listen to anything more, I've put a couple of suggestions for you, which you should be able to see on your screen now. So thank you all very much for coming along. And I'm hoping now that there might be a few questions.